This week on Inside Olympia, foster care is supposed to protect kids from unsafe conditions at home. But what happens to kids when they're taken from their homes? My guest this week researched that question deeply and has written a book that examines the harms of foster care in America. Claudia Rowe, a Seattle Times journalist, is our guest this week.
From the TBW studio, it's Inside Olympia with host Austin Jenkins.
Welcome to Inside Olympia. The child welfare system in America is supposed to take care of kids who cannot safely be with their biological parents. But removing kids from their homes and placing them in foster care can have a cascading array of negative consequences for young people. My guest this week has chronicled the plight of foster kids here in Washington and across the country, and the failings of the foster and child welfare system in a book titled Wards of the State: The Long Shadow of American Foster Care. The book was a finalist for the National Book Awards in 2025. And joining me now for the full hour this week to discuss her research and reporting is Seattle Times editorial writer and journalist, Claudia Rowe. Welcome to the program. Good to see you.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
It's nice to have you. I should note that you're a longtime journalist here in the Pacific Northwest, previously worked for the Seattle PI, now worked for Seattle Times for a period of time, now on the editorial side, and, oh, by the way, an author. Writing books.
Couple books.
And congratulations on being a finalist for the National Book Award. I mean, that is tremendous, significant.
It's great, yeah. I have to say, while it is really great as a writer, it's very gratifying, I think really what it means is the moment has come where, it's all about what do the judges want to highlight. There are, thousands of great books written every year. It's really what are the judges want to spotlight. So that they wanted to spotlight this issue, foster care, which is so often invisible to people, that's really great. I mean, that's what I think it means.
Yeah, and the way you frame that's taking a little bit of credit away from you and perhaps putting it in the hands of the judges. The way I would have looked at this is I would have thought this would be a hard topic to get on a finalist list for the National Book Award, and the fact it did shows how well you wrote this book.
Well, thanks.
And made it resonate with the judges.
I did write it for people who don't know anything about the child welfare system and think it has sort of no bearing on their lives, our lives. It's, I think a lot of people, if they think about it at all, which most people don't, it's like this, it's over here. It's a system unto itself. It deals with kids in trouble. Boom. Like, it's very separate from people's consciousness about does it connect to our life at all? And in fact, it does. And I wrote the book to make that point to any random person out there who thinks it has nothing to do with them. So I did try to write it to capture their attention.
I want to hear the story of how this book came to be, but since you've just teed this up, why don't you tell us what the thesis is and why this matters to the broader society and public?
What became apparent to me in doing the book and sort of was like this early hunch that was the seed of the book and chasing that hunch became the book. This idea this connect the dots idea, this idea that foster care is not a system sort of discrete unto itself, but is intimately connected with many other much more visible and expensive, very costly sort of social safety net systems. I now think of foster care as sort of a gear in this larger machine. You could call it the carceral machine. You could call it sort of the poverty and homelessness complex. It's a gear in this larger machine. And the thesis is essentially exploring the argument that the defense in a youth homicide case, which is what brought me into this, the defense was saying foster care is part of the reason for this crime. And that was not terribly successful with the court, but it resonated with research I had seen about 10 years earlier. So this criminal case was in 2019. And in the early 2000s, like 2006, 7, 8, in there, this longitudinal research came out showing early adult life outcomes of kids who had grown up in foster care, and they were shocking. The numbers of homeless and incarcerated kids who are either incarcerated while in foster care or immediately afterwards just blew my mind. And I wanted to show this connection. And one thing that even shocked me even more, I mean, it's like over 50% of kids who grow up in foster care will have been incarcerated somewhere by the time they're in their mid-20s. That's incredible to me for a system that's supposed to be saving kids. And the numbers of young people who are sort of immediately homeless after leaving foster care, if they age out of the system, also incredible, like 25 to 30% immediately homeless. Again, a system supposed to be saving kids. Those numbers are big numbers, and they are incredible to me. Even more incredible was the sort of broad social response, like, meh.
This is, yeah,
Just like
this is
that.
right. Yeah, like this is what happens.
Sort of
yeah.
like no
Right.
biggie. And I really could not believe that. And I guess I thought maybe people just aren't getting it. Maybe they're not seeing it, and I got to show it. So I tried to do that.
You had been reporting on this system before you decided to write the book about it. But what was the sort of tipping point to think this is worthy of a book, and I want to write that book?
It is true that I had reported on the child welfare system in Washington State some before this book. I would not say intensively. I would say some. And in kind of the way that journalism traditionally has reported on the child welfare system, which is not that deep. Really, it's about screaming headlines. It's, really bad things happen to really young children. It's a child dies because they're left with their parent and they weren't removed, or something terrible happens to them while they were in foster care. I did those stories at the Seattle PI. And that's what they were, and we cared profoundly. It's not that we were out for the screaming headline. We cared profoundly, but it was always that sort of soundbite level coverage. It never went into the day-to-day experience of being in foster care. What does it feel like to grow up in that system? And as I was looking at these outcomes, these incredibly high numbers of incarcerated kids, I wanted to understand, what puts a kid in that place where they commit a crime. And that's really what all of my work is, sort of, what are the forces that shape us?
What are and the root causes. So you tell this, you tackle this subject by telling the story through the lens of several kids who've been through these systems. And you start with Marianne, who does go to prison for murder. We are introduced to a character who spends time in group homes, which are especially traumatic experiences and places to be, where you really don't feel like it's the last stop when nobody wants you. We hear the story of Art Longworth, who's spent decades in prison for a murder he committed when he was young and had been part of that system. So somebody sort of at the later end of life and has some life experience to look back on. Somebody, Sixto, I guess is his name, who leads
incredibly
sort of this
cool name.
Very
Yes.
cool name, and grows up and sort of emerges from this very unhealthy system and becomes a reformer. How did you pick your characters? I mean, they're all compelling, but how did you pick them?
It's a really good question.
And there are others too, but
There are 6 sort of main people in the book who lead to other characters. But the first thing to do, so Marianne, this young woman, she was a teenager when she committed her crime.
And this was a crime that made headlines. It was in the news.
It was in the news, though not as much as you might think. So Marianne pled guilty to shooting a 21-year-old guy in the head in his car one February night in Seattle. The first thing I had to do when I was sitting in court, I was watching Marianne being sentenced. That was my sort of entree to this whole thing. I wasn't even there for Marianne. I wasn't even planning to write about foster care. I was interested in the work of a forensic psychologist who was maybe going to testify as to what he thought her sentence should be. He never did testify. He wasn't called to the stand. And her sentencing hearing continued and then continued again. So it was 3 days over the course of 6 weeks. And by the end, I knew a lot more about this young woman, Marianne Atkins, and I realized, oh, this is not really a crime story. This is a foster care story. And it resonated with all that research I knew about those numbers, because they were all in her. They were all her story. But the first thing to do was figure out, is she an aberration? Is she some sort of off-the-charts thing? Obviously, not every foster kid is going to commit a murder. Her act was extreme, but her path through foster care was really typical. She had about a half dozen placements, including an adoption that fell apart, and she was returned to the foster care system. All these things are pretty common experiences for kids in foster care. And in sort of trying to figure out, is she an aberration, somebody said, oh, you got to talk to this guy, Art Longworth, who you mentioned. And Art, from inside Monroe Reformatory, the prison where he was serving out a life sentence, was on his own independently looking at the same stuff. And so we started writing, and then Art's experience was very much about group homes. So then I thought, oh, I really need to understand group homes better. And somebody said, oh, you got to meet this guy Sixto, who is doing a report about what happens to kids in group homes. So one sort of question led to the next. From Sixto ended up being like a gold mine. And Sixto himself, which I talk about in the book, sort of happened upon this massive amount of lived experience data, this enormous amount of...
And this is based on surveying kids who've been in the system.
What happened was he was doing this report. Actually, it was additional to the group home report. It was about aging out. And he had all this data, hundreds of hours of interviews, and it was spring of 2020, and he was about to start writing his report, and boom, it's the pandemic. And he realizes, oh my goodness, maybe 20,000 young people are going to be hitting the streets, aging out of foster care in the middle of a global catastrophe. This is a disaster on a good day, and now we're in a global catastrophe. Yeah. He turns to his old mentors at the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and they say, we've got $50,000 you can dole out in little mini grants to kids who need a few $100s just to get off the street. He says, this is a great way to get some data. Hey, kids on social media, I have money for those of you who have just aged out of foster care. All you have to do is answer a questionnaire. And that questionnaire, he thought he'd get like 1,000 responses. He got 27,000 back in a week, and each one of them had 146 sort of data points, and then he had suddenly a database of more than 3 million pieces of information about the lived experience of kids in the foster care system. And from that, he and I went through the data, and we found, well, of all the young people who said that they had had some kind of experience with lockup, usually in juvenile detention, what were the common threads among them? And there were 4 things, and they're not terribly surprising, but those 4 things helped me identify other young people to look at who would become main characters. And the 4 things are running away, group homes, broken adoptions, and aging out alone without support. All are sort of a direct route to lockup. And through that, I was able to find more young people who illustrated sort of those pathways.
So let's step back, because the whole purpose of foster care is to get kids out of unsafe situations and place them in safer situations. And this has been going on for decades now. The best practices are evolving, and there is, as you explain in the book, much more focus now nationally and in this state on keeping kids within their biological families where possible and trying to give those families support, and where not possible to at least put them in kinship care where they're with a relative, which has not historically been the priority. But can you, sort of at a 30,000-foot level, help us understand that pendulum swing, or sort of where we are now versus where we were?
The first thing I'll say is that foster care, like almost everything else, is intensely politicized. And even though there is great bipartisan really encouraging bipartisan interest in the welfare of kids, which I find encouraging, you mentioned the pendulum swing. That's sort of traditionally what has always been. It's either we've got to remove kids from these unsafe homes, we've got to put kids with their families. And I'm going to say it's not like that. It's not.
That's not reality.
It's not absolutes.
Yeah.
It's reality in people's heads
Right,
in terms
right.
of policymakers and lawmakers
Yeah.
sometimes.
But it
about-
doesn't acknowledge the reality on the ground. It's pretty complex.
It's pretty complex. It's intensely nuanced, and
and case by case.
however, this thing that you mentioned about kinship care, and for your audience who may not know, kinship care is when a child is removed from their biological family, but instead of being placed with a stranger, they are placed with a relative or somebody close to the family, a family friend, a teacher, a coach, somebody who knows the child. Because research shows, and I saw it in my reporting again and again, that connection, attachment is enormously important in terms of outcomes. And that foster care as a system essentially sunders attachment, not only from the child and their biological family, but from each placement where they land, right? The aim of foster care, the stated aim, is permanence, which means you're reunited or you're adopted. But the reality is impermanence. It's moving from place to place to place until one of those two things happens. But it hasn't acknowledged enough that this system built on moving from place to place to place, that is extremely damaging to kids. That movement, that constant sundering of attachment and connection has really not only poor behavioral results, but biologically, chemically. There's a little bit of brain science in the book that shows what that does to cortisol levels and how cortisol levels affect behavior. So the model kind of builds in really bad outcomes simply by moving kids from place to place to place. That has really bad effects. And kinship care lessens that. It mitigates that.
So kinship care, in theory, is better. But to your point, the pendulum sort of swings, and it's kind of more complex than just foster care versus keeping kids with their biological families or maybe looking for other options. I think I would say that my first kind of entry point to this issue and topic was when I started covering Olympia in the early 2000s, and it was, I think, at the tail end of the Brahm case, or maybe kind of in the middle of it, which was this class action lawsuit in our state against the state on behalf of what became a class of, but at the time I think it was about a dozen foster kids. And one of the key issues in that case was the multiple placements. In some cases, it was like 20 or 30. Some of these kids had been moved 20, 30 times.
Yes.
And as part of the settlement, the state had to agree to meet certain metrics, including reducing the number of placements.
And tracking runaways.
And tracking runaways and ensuring siblings who weren't housed together got visits and so on and so forth. So that's not the beginning of time, but for my purposes, it sort of gives us an entry point. What would you say, that was filed in 1993, I started covering Olympia in I think 2003, so 20 plus years on. What does the rearview mirror on Brahm look like, in this state at least, would you say?
I am sorry to say that while Brahm was kind of a watershed in terms of what the settlement, not only what it stipulated and what had to happen, but the enormous amount of energy and goodwill and money that the state agreed to put toward these reforms.
Yeah.
But I will say that one of the there was in addition to all these things that the state had to do, the state convened a panel of experts to monitor how well it was doing. And these were not local. There was, I think, one Washington person on that panel. Most of them were outside experts. One of them was the lawyer and sociologist Dorothy Roberts, who's gone on to become, a huge figure in writing about foster care. And she says that her experience on the Brahm Oversight Panel for 9 years, this is a long commitment that they all made, it is her experience on that panel that changed her from a reformer to an abolitionist. She is of the mind that it cannot work, that foster care is irretrievably broken. I would say it needs to be reconceived. I don't know that I'm all the way where she is, but I find it fascinating that her experience on this panel, with all the sort of brain power and resources in the world, not so much, not great.
So if that was maybe an early 2000s way of looking at this, which is, well, if we could just give these kids a little bit more permanence or fewer moves, 5 instead of 20, and maybe they get visits with their siblings, maybe we can create some stability. And at least some will say, in hindsight, that was Pollyanna-ish, or that was too optimistic.
Well-intended, hopeful.
Well-intended, but maybe didn't have the... So then... Again, sort of time passes, and now we're very much, and I know I'm skipping a little, but we are very much in this era, and it has been led by the Department of Children, Youth, and Families, which is the new agency that split off from, was created after the split of child welfare from DSHS. And we have entered this era of making it the policy to keep kids, when possible, in their homes. And to your point, it's become very political. We've just been through this fentanyl crisis, an opioid crisis. We've seen a spike in child deaths, in near deaths, fatalities, and near fatalities. And there's a lot of fingers being pointed. Republicans in the legislature are quite frustrated and think that we've overcorrected. The pendulum has swung too far. So as we talk now in the present tense, what is your observation about how the pendulum has swung, what Washington State at least is doing, how well it's working or not working? Because as you said, it's nuanced.
Well, one place, I should say, there's no state that's like the awesome, perfect place where it's a utopia. It's not happening.
Yeah.
However, Washington State is a national leader with Illinois. I believe that's right. Yeah, Washington and Illinois are the two states that are doing kinship care the most. And there's been an enormous increase in that here. And one thing I need to say, kinship care it's not only placing the child with a relative, it's giving that relative the state support, the money.
Because in the old days, they wouldn't get it. If
they
you were
wouldn't
related,
get it. Like
you
grandma would
didn't
take in her kids, but
you
that
didn't get the state
that
stipend.
wasn't a formal relationship. Kinship care, as practiced now, means that grandma or auntie or whoever gets the monthly support from the state that was previously going to a stranger. That is essential, and also it means that that person, the relative, can be licensed to provide foster care for just their grandchild, niece, nephew, just that one kid. So they don't have to jump through every single hoop that you would have to if you were sort of a traditional foster parent. That's one thing, and Washington is way out in front on that. And the research is still sort of forming and somewhat nascent, but, it's been happening for 5 years and more than that, but intensively in the last 5 years. And the research...
And we should note that DCYF it's now led by Tana Sen, a former state legislator. The first director was Ross Hunter.
Correct.
Who was a longtime legislator, previously had worked in the tech sector, didn't have direct experience in this space. But he really made his mark on this agency by cutting in half the number of children in foster care, which he did. There are presently about 5,000 kids in the system. There used to be 8,000, even up to 10. So yes, and one of the sort of there are a lot of feelings about Ross Hunter, but one of the primary efforts he made was to increase kinship care. And that is something that Sixto Cancel, who you mentioned, is working to do at the federal level. It lines up what Ross sort of spearheaded here and what we are doing in Washington does line up with sort of
the leading edge of what reformers want to see. So good. And the results out of kinship care, nothing's a perfect miracle, but they are better because it's more stability. Not only is it fewer moves around, more stability, it's also a connection. That connection that is ongoing with a hopefully trustworthy adult really makes a difference in kids' behavior. And that is what we're talking about. What are we talking about? We're talking about crime in the end, right? And trying to have less of it.
Right, and just bad outcomes in general.
Right.
But the kinship care is still taking kids out of their homes, away from their biological parents.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also a tremendous effort to keep kids with their biological parents. And you noted that, I guess it was by 50%, but at one point it was 25%. I guess ultimately it was 50% that foster care shrunk in this state. Mm-hmm. But the initial sort of reduction, at the same time you report or you write that 11 kids died at home in the first few months of this effort to really raise the bar for pulling kids away from their biological parents. So what's the flip side of this equation in terms of, and we've continued to see from the state ombuds, children and family ombuds, as recently as their last report, pretty concerning numbers.
Yeah, because two things. A lot of people, I think understandably, blame a law that Washington passed in, I think it was 21 or 2, called the Keeping Families Together Act. It went into practice in 23. And it essentially, as the name would suggest, it raises the bar for child removal. It makes it tougher to remove a child from their home. It is also supposed to provide a great deal more support for families that are struggling. This is the part we don't have together at all. The sort of oversight of a family that has landed on the state's radar for concerns about child safety, and then if you're not going to remove the child, okay, well, what do you do to safeguard that child's safety in the home? This is the part we don't have.
Especially like if there are drugs in the home or drug use that's happening, which has been, again, one of the key points of contention in the legislature. And we should make clear, Ross Hunter was not just by edict doing this. He had the legislature setting policy and he was implementing it. But we're now seeing some of the results of this. And the feeling is, the question that's being asked is, why would we let a kid whose parents or a parent is addicted to some, to fentanyl, to something,
so frankly,
or the opioids is in the, still allowed to be in the home.
Right. So I think there are drugs and there are drugs, right? Fentanyl, I think, is pretty well established that a person who's addicted to fentanyl can't really do anything else. They're fairly incapacitated, it appears, to everyone. So I could see making a determination on fentanyl. There was a bill floated this past session that would have said child removal if there are drugs of any kind in the home, with an exception for cannabis. Okay, an exception for marijuana.
Which is legal.
Which is legal, right. Okay, but would we really be removing a child from an affluent family where the parent is, using cocaine or mushrooms or something on the weekends? I highly doubt it. Foster care is targeted exclusively at low-income and poor families. There are no middle-class or affluent kids or foster care, and all of us probably know middle-class or affluent families where there's all kinds of substance abuse, possibly child abuse, and possibly neglect. Not material neglect, other kinds of neglect. So I think that laws that are sort of absolute, I think New Mexico just passed one that is exactly that. Any drug of any kind, kids out of there. I think there's a balancing act here.
Well, to that point, though, do you think that this state, and we got to go to break here, but do you think that the state, using the pendulum analogy again, has maybe gone too far in that direction? And maybe if it's not any drug, the kid is out, we need to be a little bit more aggressive
On
about
fentanyl, for sure, and the legislature tweaked its laws on fentanyl. It could maybe do a little more. I think that, like I said, there are all kinds of drugs, and not all drugs are the same.
Right. Okay. Let's take a quick break. When we return, we continue our conversation about foster care in America and here in Washington State with journalist and author Claudia Rowe. Back right after this.
We are really in an AI race with China, and we need to make sure that we win this race. And the worry is that if state lawmakers, for specific interest at the state level, create environments that effectively become the de facto national standard, that you won't have that creative process that goes on. It's so critical that America win this race with China, and we continue to maintain this lead, because it is our national security that's at stake.
Welcome back to Inside Olympia. Joining me once again is journalist and author Claudia Rowe, who wrote the book Wards of the State, The Long Shadow of American Foster Care. We cannot talk about foster care without talking about the disproportionality. You were just talking about the focus or the impact on lower income families. Disproportionately, kids who are put into foster care in this country and historically have been Black and brown, African American, Latino, Native American. Children have been pulled historically out of their homes at much higher rates. Some of the stats in your book, child welfare touches the lives of more than a third of kids and 53% of all Black youth.
Doesn't mean 53% of all Black youth are taken into foster care.
Right.
It means families are investigated.
Touched in some way by the child welfare system. Yeah, so not foster care, but child welfare, right. So help us understand, and maybe the kind of an entry point to this is that you also write about this judge in New Orleans Parish who kind of made it her mission single-handedly to reverse the practice of pulling kids out of their homes and focus on this, keeping them together, because she was aware of the historical implications here, going all the way back to slavery. Right.
Judge Ernestine Gray, who is recently retired, is a fascinating character, and there's a chapter dedicated to her work that's in the book. Judge Gray grew up in segregated South Carolina in the 40s and 50s. Her entire career, she was on the bench in juvenile court in Orleans Parish. And in Orleans Parish, juvenile court handles both dependency cases, that's foster care, and juvenile crime cases. So Judge Gray kept seeing all these kids come into her courtroom being, petitioned for dependency, for removal into foster care. And she wondered, because she knew very well that there were plenty of white kids who were being, left for hours at daycare because their mom or dad or whoever wasn't showing up to pick them up. And plenty of white kids were, running around without clothes or food. But only Black kids were showing up in Judge Gray's courtroom, and she started to become, feel kind of queasy about this. She herself is an African-American woman, and she started to see herself as a sort of a cog in this machine that I mentioned before, this larger machine of really negative outcomes, and it was, for Black kids in her case. That's what she was looking at. So she didn't do anything so radical. She simply held the state to the letter of the law. The law says you have to try to help a family before you remove their kids. But it was sort of like a rubber stamp. Nobody was really doing that intensively. It was kind of like, oh yeah, we tried. She just said, no, show me what you did, prove it, or have you reached out to a relative to see if somebody can take this child? She just simply made social workers, I think she would say, do their job, with fidelity and rigor. But her methods were pretty tough. I mean, she was...
And controversial.
Well, it was incredibly controversial because on her watch and under her sort of campaign to really lessen foster care in Orleans Parish dropped to double digits. There's 75,000 kids in New Orleans, a city of 400,000 people. There were 20 kids in long-term foster care. she essentially ended it. In Orleans Parish, there's a lot of churn. Kids who were in the system for a year and out, in and out. She kind of ended that.
But there was clearly a racial justice component to this.
Clearly.
And I'll just add another statistic that you talk about the fact that disproportionately kids who go from foster homes into group homes, which is again where the research shows a lot of bad things kind of end up happening psychologically and otherwise to kids. Again, in this country, disproportionately, it's African American kids who are ending up in group homes. So she was recognizing kind of the historical bias built into the system and she was trying to protect the kids in the moment and keep the families together in the moment, but she was also trying to correct for what she viewed as a long legacy of racism in the
Absolutely. I think what was controversial was not so much her racial bent, but really like returning kids to families that could have been perceived as unsafe. But what she did mostly was a version of kinship care. She turned children over to relatives, and what the criticism was, then their cases were closed. Like, okay, we shipped you off to granny or auntie, and the cases were closed. And, her critics would say, well, just because a case is closed doesn't mean the kid is safe. And we don't have any way to track that. We don't know what's going on. And her answer was, well, they're not coming back to my courtroom. Nobody is referring them to foster care anymore. And, researchers well outside of Judge Gray's courtroom, researchers at Casey Family Programs, couldn't believe the numbers. They thought something was wrong. So they studied her. And what they found was that child fatalities and critical incidents in Orleans Parish were actually less than in other parts of the state, like Baton Rouge, that put many more children into foster care. So the researchers are like, what, this seems weird, but the numbers are, don't appear to be saying her route is wrong.
Can you walk us through a little bit of the linkage she made between family separation and slavery?
Sure. In her words and in her thinking, it was this, that family separation has been used as sort of a threat hanging over the heads of certain families in this country going all the way back to slavery. Family separation being a way that overseers on plantations kept, their slaves in line with the threat, we're going to take your kids, we're going to sell you down the river, and you're never going to see your kid again. Right. And then, I learned a lot about history from talking to Judge Gray. There were laws in immediately after the Civil War and the Reformation period that made vagrancy, sort of unemployed black men, could be criminalized and put in jail. And then, you can't support your family is destitute.
Right. There's a single mom now.
There's a single mom, maybe.
Yeah.
And so now we can legally take the kid and we can put them back on the plantation, and we can call these apprenticeships in the best interests of the child because they can't be supported at home. That's language, very similar to what we use today, as Judge Gray observed. One thing that began to happen in the early 20th century was that the government, the U.S. government, said, we see all these widows, whose husbands had been killed in the First World War and who were raising children on their own. And these were mostly white women. And so the government began to issue widows' pensions, but only to white families. Every state could make their own criteria, and the South didn't want black women to get these widows' pensions. And so they said, well, these stipends can't go to anyone who has children out of wedlock, and they also can't go to women raising children who are employed in certain professions, particularly domestics, housekeepers, almost all black women. The federal government in 1961 said, this doesn't feel right. This seems weird. We need some standards across the board. And they essentially said, hey, if we are saying that you, black mom, are unsuitable in some moral category, that so unsuitable, we're not going to give you government money to care for your kids. Well, if your household is unsuitable, we can't in good conscience leave the kids there. We'll take the kids. And that is when foster care became, it switched from almost entirely white to, to increasingly black.
We, of course, also have a long history in this country of taking away Native American children, placing them in quote-unquote boarding schools, trying to assimilate them. A legacy there as well that at least needs to be acknowledged. So there's racial disproportionality in this system and racial disproportionality in terms of outcomes. And so when we think about what you talked about as sort of like the kid who grows up in foster care and where they end up in life, in prison, homeless, not able in some ways to just pull themselves together as functioning adults, that comes through a lot, that maybe they're not in prison, but they're not super functioning in society. Again, we need to be considering that this is also, it's happening to this cohort of people, but it's disproportionately also going to be kids of color. Let's transition to that though. Like what are the outcomes like when kids end up aging out of these systems, whether that's at 18 or 21 or 25? And we have tried to extend that runway a little bit, but at some point, the state services and the state money goes away.
So, right. I think a really important sort of reeling it back is look at schools. So in Washington state, about 50% of high school students who are in foster care don't get a high school diploma. They drop out. That is actually a vast improvement, that number, 50%, over the 38%. About 10 years ago, when I first started really looking at this stuff, 10 years? Yeah, about 10 years ago, it was only 38% of kids in high school who are foster youth were getting diplomas. 38%. That's atrocious. We need to look at our school system. There has been, as I said, a pretty considerable improvement just to get it to 50%, but still, foster youth of all colors have the worst educational outcomes of any student group in our state, worse than homeless students in terms of graduation rates and every other metric, scores and academic achievement, all the stuff. This has to do with being moved from placement to placement, having no stability. So we need to go way, way back and look at schools. I would say you mentioned outcomes. So the outcomes are, we've said them a lot. Unemployment, homelessness, and incarceration. Those are the primary outcomes.
And mental illness.
Yeah. I think if we assessed or measured foster care differently, if we measured different outcomes, we would probably have different results. Right now, all we measure as a system is permanence. How many were adopted, how many were reunited. That's how we measure the efficacy of our foster care system. But what if we measured how many get diplomas, how many get a 4-year college degree or trade certification, how many have living wage jobs, by
how
the
many
time
kids 5 or 10 years out of
That's what
system?
I'm saying.
Yeah.
Right. When they're in their mid-20s, how many
Yeah.
have stable housing? How many
Right.
have living wage jobs? We do not. We do not systematically measure those things. If we did, I think we would reverse engineer a very different kind of system.
I do want to, we have had foster parents on this program in the past, and I don't know if it's flipping the script, but I would like to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about, we're always struggling to have enough people to do this work. It's not easy. There's a lot of people who are doing it for, very genuine and good reasons. They really want to be there for kids who most people won't take into their home. Can you speak a little bit to, the good sides of foster care? I mean, some kids can't be with their parents, and some kids there isn't a kinship opportunity. And we do have a cadre of foster parents willing to step in.
I appreciate the question because I want to make this point really clear. There are no villains in that book that I wrote. I do not think that it's about uncaring social workers or abusive foster parents. I do not. I think
And there are those cases. There are failures of the
Sure,
system,
yeah,
and there
but
is abuse that
that's not
happens
what
in foster
That's
care.
not what these outcomes are about.
Yeah.
These outcomes are about the structure of a system that is essentially built on impermanence, on shuffling kids all over the place. That's the reason for the really bad outcomes. Yes, I have written the stories. We talked about it at the beginning of the show.
We all have.
We've all written the stories
Yeah.
about the
and
horrible...
the state has paid out the lawsuit dollars.
Hundreds of millions of dollars. But most foster parents I've met, care deeply and passionately about the kids. Love is not always enough, right? The reality is kids come into the system traumatized just by the fact that they're in the system, right? Like whatever happened at their family home, good or bad, if they were removed improperly, right? If their family was great and they should never have been removed. It doesn't happen that much, but okay. But say they should never have been removed and the family, the problem was really just deep poverty and it was misunderstood and they are improperly in the system. And that was certainly true some years ago, much more than now. Just by being taken away and placed in the system, that in itself was a trauma, right? And that is not something that's going to be overcome by a caring foster parent because of that sort of essential wrenching rip inside the kid. That is real trauma. It is real damage. And the way the system traditionally has addressed that is drugs, psychotropic drugs, anti-anxiety drugs, antidepressants, and drugs to sleep, antipsychotics. Like all the kids that I talked to were all prescribed these cocktails of drugs that were never formulated for children to begin with. I mean, it is not really about, it's not about bad foster parents. It's about how much can a foster parent do to mitigate that kind of trauma. And then you get into the question of professional foster parents, which is a really worthwhile conversation. Washington state mandates, as many states do, that foster parents have other employment. Even though foster parenting is in itself a job, that's not supposed to be the job that you live on. You're not supposed to be living on the state stipends. It's extra. You're supposed to have regular outside employment. But what if we made foster parenting like an actual therapeutic intervention? What if we wanted and we had foster parents be sort of a part of the kid's treatment, not simply a way station babysitter, which is frankly the way the state treats a lot of foster parents, is these like interchangeable widgets, and we're plunking a kid down in your house and we're taking him away. Foster parents are not treated that well by the state, they tell me.
So let's, in the balance of time we have, which is just a few minutes, let's talk about reforms. Obviously, the data show that the outcomes are not good. The system, as you said, is failing.
Has always failed.
Has always failed. So and the debates that are happening are responsive to the crises of the moment, which is, for instance, that we've had near or potentially record level deaths and near deaths among children in child welfare system, which should snap policymakers to attention. Mm-hmm. But what would the longer arc of reform look like? How could we reform a system that has failed so many kids over so many decades?
So foster care is essentially a holding system, or if you like, a housing system. It's a way that we put kids in a house with a roof and a bed and a meal, right? Like that's what it is. It needs to be reconceived as a healing system, not a way station that we're just waiting for them to become 18 or 21 if they take extended foster care, which you can. That's what it is. It's a sort of like a waiting room where we wait for them to age out or go home.
Go back to their biological families, yeah.
But what if it were a therapeutic intervention? What if it wasn't a holding system, but it was conceived, reimagined as a healing system? Well, what would we do? We would do things that strongly encouraged and supported attachment and connection. So things like kinship care are in that direction. Yes, there are other things like, what if your foster parent, say there wasn't a suitable relative, as you asked, okay, what if the child were able to stay with a foster parent who had real training in how to handle really challenging behaviors and mental health crises?
Because typically what happens is when a kid gets too hard to handle in foster care, the foster care parents say to the state, you need to take this kid back.
They say, I didn't sign up for this, I can't deal with it, take the kid.
And then they end up in a group home or another
With
placement.
each placement, I mean, I saw this with Marianne and with every kid I've looked at. With each placement change, behavior deteriorates. It gets worse and worse and worse, and it gets worse, and the foster parent says, please take this kid away, and then they go to a new place, and it gets worse still.
So you said nobody has figured this out, but what are the conversations around sort of therapeutic foster care and reimagining and reestablishing a different kind of system?
I don't hear those conversations at the legislative level. I hear them in a very theoretical sort of, foundations and think tanks and those kinds of people, academics, think about it, talk about it, sort of hypothesize about it, and there are little pilots, but I don't know of. If there is, please inform me, but I don't know of.
And no state you know of that's figured this out.
No state is sort of surging ahead with reimagining their foster care system, as far as I'm aware. I spent 6 years on the book, and I never heard about it.
What is something in the 2 minutes we have left that we haven't touched on that you think is important to leave the audience with? Or where do you want to leave folks with, whether they be policymakers or people outside of the, citizens of the state who are obviously have an interest in this? And, the costs are
right there. That's where I'll leave it.
Undeniable.
Okay, so I try very hard to think about the ways different people could receive the information in the book. If you are a person who can't really get there with the kids, maybe you don't know that many kids, you can't really get in their head, that's not really your interest, maybe you care about the numbers, right? This country is spending $34 billion on foster care every year, and its outcomes are simply fueling even more expensive systems, the carceral system, anti-homelessness policies. I mean, we're spending so many billions of dollars, and foster care is kind of an engine for those systems.
It's actually feeding these systems that are then going to cost taxpayers
it's feeding them.
more.
It's channeling kids, like they are fuel for these systems. So if the sort of moral argument doesn't really carry weight with a person, I try to talk about numbers and money. This is incredibly expensive, and it's costly in every way: human capital, human waste, human misery, and dollars. It just doesn't make any sense. The other thing I would say is the system that we have in this country for foster care is essentially the same as it was 100 years ago, except for the kinship care increase. But the model is the same. But we know a lot more now, in the last 20 years only, about brain science. We need to align the system to what we know about brain science. We know from science what trauma does and what sort of instability does. We need to make our system match what we know from the science.
And just very briefly, there's the dollar amounts and the cost. What is, just in a few words, the human toll? You interviewed all these kids, you saw the struggles, even the good stories kind of were still stories of being
The reason that the book is subtitled The Long Shadow of American Foster Care is not some sort of blip in a person's past
that you emerge from, and then it's in the rearview
that's
mirror.
Your childhood and it's gone. It is a shadow over an entire life. Even people who are really successful, it's a shadow. It's pervading their vision. It is the way they see the world. It's also a shadow over all of us in this country because of the costs I just mentioned.
Okay. The book is Wards of the State, The Long Shadow of American Foster Care. The author is Claudia Rowe. Thank you for writing the book. Thank you for coming in to talk with us. Thank you for covering this subject. And again, congratulations on being a finalist for the National Book Award.
Thank you so much for having me and for your interest in this really important topic.
Good to have you. And thank you for watching Inside Olympia. We'll see you again next week.